Welcome back to the Halls of History. Hope everyone is enjoying the beginning of the preseason. The Hall of Fame inductions, always such great speeches, training camps, and the hope that comes for the upcoming season. Of course, that's provided there haven't been already too many injuries with your favorite team. I am sticking with rushing stars for this episode. At the end of my last show, The Gray Ghost of Gonzaga, about former Packer great Tony Canadeo, running back who could do it all, my trivia question for you. 7 times in the history of the NFL, a franchise has had a pair of runners reach the 1,000-yard milestone in the same season. Who were the first pair? The answer? Larry Csonka and Mercury Morris of the Miami Dolphins in the perfect season of 1972. I'll get to the other 6 pairs a little later, but first, some history to look at how this may have happened, and not just because the Dolphins were perfect. Through the first 40 seasons of the NFL, 1920 through 1959, a player reaching 1,000 yards rushing in a season had only happened 10 times, and just once in the All-America Football Conference. And by this point, only the Eagles' Steve Van Buren, San Francisco's Joe Perry, and the Browns' Jim Brown had done it twice. And before anyone wants to disagree with me on how many times the great Jim Brown eclipsed 1,000, remember, I said through 1959, which only encompasses his first 3 years in the league. The NFL season was just 12 games back then, so a player had to average 83.3 yards per game. Now in a current 17-game season, that average would get you 1,416 yards, so just to give you a little bit of an idea there. In 1960, even with it still being a 12-game schedule, for the first time, 3 players ran for a grand, with Brown leading the way, followed by the Packers' Jim Taylor and John David Crow of the Cardinals. The move to a 14-game schedule happened the next year in 1961. Now, the American Football League did not have a 1,000-yard rusher until 1962, the league's 3rd season, when Buffalo's Cookie Gilchrist, the Dallas Texans, who later became the Kansas City Chiefs, Abner Haynes did it, and the Oilers' Charlie Tolar hit the milestone. In the decade of the 60s, a running back ran for the magic number 31 times combined between the NFL and the AFL. But still, neither league had more than 3 in a season. And in 1969, the year before the merger, only Chicago Bears legend Gale Sayers got there with 1,032. Now, with the NFL-AFL merger, only 2 rushers got to 1,000 in 1970, Washington's Larry Brown and the Giants' Ron Johnson. A league record 5 rushers ran for 1K in 1971, but something happened between 71 and 72 that really gave a springboard to some absolutely incredible rushing attacks. Hash marks. That's right. Those little marks that you see throughout the middle of the field showing each yard, but of course not extending all the way sideline to sideline like it does every 5 yards. The hash mark made its first appearance on an NFL field during the 1932 NFL Championship game between the Chicago Bears and the Portsmouth Spartans. The Spartans became the Detroit Lions in 1934. But the title game was played indoors. Now, following that game that the Bears won 9-0, George Halas and George Preston Marshall convinced the NFL to permanently add the hash mark in 1933 and placed 10 yards from the sideline. Sounds a little close, doesn't it? Well, here we go with what began the hash mark creep. In 1935, the marks were moved another 5 yards infield, so now 15 from the sideline. In 1945, it got bumped another 5, so now 20 yards from the sidelines. Each time the hash marks were moved, it was done with the hope that it could help open things up for offenses, give them a little bit more maneuverability with a little bit more space. The hash marks stayed at 20 yards from the side all the way until 1972, when they got moved again, and for the final time to 23.5 yards. The move was done this time because some incredibly dominant defenses had emerged. The Packers, the Chiefs, the Colts, the Vikings, and the Rams, just to name a few. And there was a huge drop-off in touchdowns scored. In 1969, the NFL with 16 teams scored a total of 564, while the AFL with 10 teams crossed the goal line a total of 344 times. Add it up, and you have 908 touchdowns, an average of roughly 34.9 per team. In 1970, the first year of now the whole NFL with 26 teams, only 797 were scored, an average of 30.7 per team. Plus, the average rushing yards per game for the whole league was 120.4. In 1971, there was a little rise in TDs all the way up to 806. Well, we all know that everybody keeps saying defenses win championships, but offenses sell tickets. So the league moved the hash marks, but it was in the hopes that it would really open up the passing game. Well, instead, it unleashed the ground game. In 1972, total touchdowns rose to 840, and the league average of rushing yards per game jumped to 130.1. And remember that in the previous 2 seasons since the merger, that there were only 7 combined 1,000-yard rushers. Well, in 1972, a record 10 backs hit the magic number. O.J. Simpson for the Bills, Larry Brown for Washington, Ron Johnson for the Giants, Marv Hubbard for Oakland, the Steelers' Franco Harris, the Cowboys' Calvin Hill, San Diego's Mike Garrett, Green Bay's John Brockington, and of course Larry Csonka and Mercury Morris for Miami. Csonka, the big bruising fullback drafted in 1968, was in his 4th season and had put up a career-best 874 yards in 1970 and was voted to his first Pro Bowl. Mercury Morris, the speedster with the moves who could run around and then right by you, entered his 3rd season after being drafted in 1969. Morris had been an exciting kick returner and was generally the 3rd option in the backfield behind Csonka and Jim Kick. But in 1972, Morris explosiveness helped him jump ahead of Kick and get more opportunities. The trio of Csonka, Morris, and Kick also had the advantage of running behind one of the best offensive lines in the league and could even be up for arguably one of the greatest of all time. Hall of Famer Jim Langer at center, with guards Bob Kuechenberg and Hall of Famer Larry Little, and then tackles Doug Cruzan, Wayne Moore, and Norm Evans. Langer was named to 6 straight Pro Bowls, albeit beginning in 1973, but also was a first or second team All-Pro 5 times. Now, Little was a 5-time Pro Bowler, 5-time first team All-Pro, and was even in the top 10 in voting for the Associated Press MVP and the AP Offensive Player of the Year in 72. Morris once said that running behind Little was so great because who wanted to get in front of that 265-pounder who had speed? Bob Kuechenberg, who really should be in the Hall of Fame, was a 6-time Pro Bowler and first-team All-Pro in 1978 over a 14-year career all in Miami. Norm Evans at right tackle was named to the Pro Bowl in 72 and 74. After starting every game the previous 3 seasons, left tackle Doug Cruzan started 9 games in 72, missing some time to injury, and he had 6'6" third-year pro Wayne Moore filling in the other 5 games. Moore went to the Pro Bowl in 73. Csonka led the Dolphins with 195 carries for 1,051 yards and 7 touchdowns. He had 4 100-yard games on the way to his first career 1,000-yard season. He even put up 118 yards in the opener against the Chiefs, one of those great defenses that led the league to push those hash marks just a little further. Morris only had 57 carries in 1971, but averaged 5.5 per carry and gained 315 yards. In 72, he more than tripled that, with 190 rushes for exactly 1,000 yards and a league-leading 12 touchdowns. Morris really came along in the middle of the season. After scoring twice on just 5 carries in a Week 6 win over Buffalo, Morris ran for 71 yards against the Colts and then recorded his first 100-yard game of the season and just the second of his career, with 106 on only 11 rushers in another win over the Bills. From Week 6 through 10, Morris rushed for 409 yards and 10 scores. Now, don't think that Jim Kick was just totally forgotten in all of this. The 3rd running option for Miami still carried the rock 137 times for 521 yards and 5 TDs. So not only did you have Csonka and Morris as the first pair of teammates to go over 1,000 in the same season, but a 3rd rusher with over 500, and he wasn't the quarterback. And talk about a ground game from that running back room. The Dolphins just wore opposing defenses down and destroyed their will on the way to a 14-0 regular season. Now, the passing game was there when it was needed and generally went deep many times when they did actually throw. Hall of Famer Paul Warfield only caught 29 passes, but averaged almost 21 yards per catch, and Howard Twilley had 20 grabs with over 18 yards per reception. Marlon Briscoe averaged another 17 yards per catch on 16 grabs. 4th receiver Otto Stowe over 21 yards per catch with 13 receptions. Miami rushed for 725 more yards than they gained in the passing attack, and that rolled right on into the playoffs as the Dolphins ran for 198 in the win over the Browns, 193 over Pittsburgh, and finally 184 against Washington in Super Bowl VII. Csonka ran for 212 yards in the 3 playoff wins with 112 on just 15 carries in the Super Bowl. Morris totaled 182 yards on 41 carries, and Kick rushed for 100 yards on 34 carries throughout the playoffs. Csonka had 2 more 1,000-yard seasons and ran his way to Canton as a member of the class of 1987. Morris rushed for 954 yards in 1973 and 875 in 1975, but never again got to a grand. So the rushing attack was now wide open. It takes a few years before the next duo reaches the 1,000 plateau. 1976, and it was Franco Harris and Rocky Bleier of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Franco gained 1,128 yards on 289 carries and 14 scores, his fourth time over 1,000, and Bleier went off for 1,036 on 220 carries. It was the first and only time in his career to reach the magic number. Harris went over 100 yards 6 times in 76. Bleier, meanwhile, finished the season in a flurry. Through the first 8 games, Rocky rushed for 436 yards, averaging just 54.5 yards per game, which would have put him at 763 for the year over the 14-game schedule. But Bleier took off beginning in Week 9 with 102, 110, 66, 97, 118, and ending with 107 in the finale to reach the milestone. Bleier plugged away for 600 yards over those 6 games. Pittsburgh did not get to the Super Bowl that year, losing to the Raiders in the AFC title game, as oddly enough, the Steelers didn't have either Franco or Rocky for that game as the two 1,000-yard rushers were injured. Franco finished his career with 8 seasons over 1,000 and was inducted as a first-ballot Hall of Famer in 1990. So after the hash marks had been moved, the NFL saw an explosion of 1,000-yard rushers over those first 5 seasons. But another duo didn't reach that number together again until 1985, and it was the Cleveland Browns. Cleveland went 8-8 in 1985, won the AFC Central, remember that division name, but lost to the Dolphins in the divisional round. But the ground game was on track that year with 2 bruising backs in Kevin Mack and Ernest Byner. Mack was selected 11th overall in the 1984 supplemental draft, but played the 84 season with the Los Angeles Express in the USFL, and rushed for 330 yards. So he was an NFL rookie in 1985. And the 224-pounder nicknamed Mack Truck, with the big shoulder pads, bulldozed his way to 1,104 yards and was named AFC Rookie of the Year. Ernest Byner was a 10th round selection of the Browns in 1984, 280th overall, but ran for 426 yards as a rookie. In 85, Byner rolled out 1,002. Mack had 3 100-yard games and eclipsed 1,000 yards in a Week 14 loss at Seattle. Byner had 2 100-yard games, including 101 in the finale, to just get past 1,000. In the playoff loss to the Dolphins, Byner was unstoppable with 161 yards on 16 carries and 2 scores. Mack ran 13 times for 56 yards. The closest Mack ever got to 1,000 yards again was gaining over 700 in 1987, 1990, and 91. Now, Byner never crossed the 1K barrier again in Cleveland, but he did twice with Washington with over 1,200 in 1990 and 1,048 in 91 on the way to winning a Super Bowl. He just missed out on a 3rd straight 1,000-yard season with 998 in 1992. Oh, so close. The passing game finally began to thrive throughout the 1980s and 90s, and while there were still plenty of 1,000-yard rushers, most teams had that one that could carry the load instead of a two-headed monster. But we weren't finished seeing teammates reach the 1,000 milestone together. But it did take all the way until 2006, and this time a quarterback jumped into the mix. That's right, the Atlanta Falcons with Warrick Dunn and Michael Vick. Despite going 7-9 and missing the playoffs, the Falcons wowed football fans with some thrilling runs. They just couldn't always finish drives, ranking 25th in scoring offense. Dunn was 31 years old and in his 10th year in the league, 5th with Atlanta. He had already eclipsed 1,000 4 times, including a career-best 1,416 the year before. He was also the 2004 Walter Payton Man of the Year and had the respect of so many across the league on and off the field. Michael Vick had been flashing his amazing running skills since he was a rookie in 2001 and was now entering his 6th season. Vick was close in 2004 with 902 yards rushing, and he did miss 1 game. However, in 06, Dunn got off to a terrific start with 262 yards combined in the first 2 games and ran for 146 in week 6. It was his last 100-yard game of the season, but Dunn stayed nice and steady throughout the rest of the year and reached 1,000 yards in week 15 against the Cowboys. Vick also had 3 100-yard games, beginning with 127 in week 2 against the Bucs, then 101 2 weeks later against the Cardinals, and then 166 on just 12 runs in a week 12 loss to the Saints. Things slowed down a little for Vick, but he became the very first quarterback in league history with over 1,000 yards rushing in a season, week 16 versus the Panthers. The previous record was 968 by Bobby Douglas for the Bears in 1972. So close in that record-breaking year. In fact, Randall Cunningham and then Vick in 2004 had been the only other QBs to gain over 900. More on signal callers coming up. 2006 was Dunn's final 1,000-yard season, and Vick never reach that high again either. Now, the passing was really flying across the NFL in the 2000s, but it still didn't take long to get to our next duo, the New York Giants in 2008 with Brandon Jacobs and Derek Ward. The G-men were coming off their incredible upset win over the previously undefeated New England Patriots in the Super Bowl the year before and went 12-4 in 08, winning the NFC East. Jacobs was a load at 6'4" and 264 pounds. Ward was 5 inches shorter, but still quite stout at 240 pounds. Jacobs had first reached 1,000 yards in 2007 with 1,009. In 08, he blasted his way to 1,089 and 15 touchdowns. Ward had a career-high 602 in 07, but ran right by that total with 1,025 in 08. Both rushers averaged at least 5 yards a carry. And Jacobs even missed 3 games that season, including the finale, but had 4 100-yard games. He eclipsed the milestone in Week 14 by 2 yards. Jacobs missed the next game, then ran for 87 in a win over the Panthers in Week 16, but then missed the final game. Ward had been a steady presence throughout the year and had a 100-yard game in Week 6. From Week 7 through 15, Ward didn't even run for 70 yards. And then there was the game against the Panthers. Ward exploded for 215 yards on 15 carries and went from looking like he was going to get maybe just up over 800 yards for the year to being within 52 yards with 1 game remaining. He then ran for 77 yards in the finale, and the Giants had the 5th duo to gain 1,000 yards. Neither runner got that far again. Jacobs rushed for over 800 yards in each of the next 2 seasons. Ward left New York in free agency and landed in Tampa Bay, rushing for just 409 yards in 2009, his highest total over his final 3 years in the NFL. Football fans only had to wait for the next season for the 6th pair of teammates as the Carolina Panthers, the team that couldn't stop Derek Ward the year before, reached the feat in 2009. Jonathan Stewart and D'Angelo Williams could not be stopped. Stewart with 1,133 and Williams with 1,117 have combined for the most out of all the duos with 2,250 yards. Both also averaged over 5 yards per run. Stewart was in his 2nd year and had run for 836 in 08. Williams was in his 4th year and was among the league leaders in 08 with 1,515 and did lead with 18 rushing touchdowns. And if you do the math, those two actually combined for more yards, 2,351, than they did in 09 when both went over 1,000. Stewart played in all 16 games and only started 3, the 3 games that Williams missed toward the end of the season. Williams looked like he was in line for another incredible year with 4 100-yard games through the first 10 games of the season, and 3 of those were over 140 yards. But then he ran for just 40 yards in the 11th game, getting him over 1,000, and then proceeded to miss 3 of the final 5 games. And that is where we saw Stewart explode. Earlier in the year, we did see what could happen when both are healthy, and the opposing defense just could not make an adjustment. In Week 6 at Tampa Bay, Williams ran for 152 yards on 30 carries and 2 scores. Stewart put up 110 yards on 17 carries and 1 TD. That was Stewart's only 100-yard game until he had to step into the starting role. Week 13 against the Bucs again. Sorry to keep picking on you, Tampa Bay. Stewart had 120 yards. The following week, Williams was back and ran for 82, and Stewart had 20 against the Patriots. But those last 3 games were all Stewart. First, he had 109 in a win over the Vikings. Then he went off for 206 in a 41-9 win over the Giants and reached 1,000 yards. Finally, Stewart recorded 125 in the finale, a win over the Saints. Carolina finished 8-8 and missed the playoffs. Stewart never got back to 1,000, but was close in 2015 with 989 and went to the Pro Bowl. Williams also did not get back to the milestone, as unfortunately injuries derailed a very promising career. Came closest with 907 as a member of the Steelers, also in 2015. It looked as if we may not get to see that happen again as the passing numbers just continued to skyrocket. And yet, it did happen one more time. 2019 with Lamar Jackson and Mark Ingram of the Baltimore Ravens, and the second time with one of the two being a QB. Jackson ran right by Michael Vick's quarterback rushing record with 1,206, averaging nearly 7 yards per run. Ingram tallied his 3rd career 1,000-yard season with 1,018 and scored 10 touchdowns. Jackson was named the league MVP because he also got it done with his arm, throwing for over 3,100 yards and 36 touchdowns compared to just 6 interceptions. He gained over 100 yards on the ground 5 times that season and didn't even play in the regular season finale. Jackson eclipsed a grand in Week 14 at Buffalo. Ingram had 4 100-yard games and broke 1,000 for the year in Week 16 at Cleveland. He also did not play the final game. The Ravens finished 14-2, won the AFC North, but then could not slow down the rushing attack of Derrick Henry and the Titans in the divisional round. King Henry rolled over Baltimore with 195 yards on 30 carries and even had a 3-yard TD pass to Corey Davis. 7 duos in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards in the same season. But there have been many others that have gotten pretty close. In fact, there have been 10 other times where franchises had either one runner over 1,000 and a second over 900 or 2 over 900 for the year. The Dolphins almost did it back-to-back as Csonka went over 1K and Morris had 954 in 1973, a 14-game season. Cincinnati was painfully close in 73 as well. Essex Johnson had 997 and Booby Clark totaled 988. But possibly the closest without getting there were the 1978 Chicago Bears. Walter Payton was well over with 1,390, and behind him was Roland Harper, 992. 8 yards away, so plenty of times in the 70s. In the 1980s, along with Mack and Biner reaching the mark in 1985, there were a couple of teams that were close, but just couldn't get there in the decade. But in the 1990s, nobody was close, not even within sniffing distance. And of course you could say, well, the passing game and its emergence. But we have seen passing numbers skyrocket even beyond the numbers in the 90s after 2000. And a pair of teammates getting to 1,000 yards has happened 4 more times. Out of the 7 duos, the only one to win or even reach the Super Bowl were the 1972 Miami Dolphins. So there you go, folks. The history of teammates to eclipse 1,000 yards rushing in the same season. Do you think somebody might be able to do it this year? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below as far as which team you think it might be. 2 running backs, quarterback and a running back? Never know. But for the next episode, I'm going to switch gears back to the passing game. Sorry for those of you who love the rushing attack. Now here's your trivia question for my next video that will be out on Monday, August 21st. Who was the first player in NFL history to record 4 seasons with at least 90 receptions? Couple of hints. He came up through the late 80s and early 90s and was also pretty much the only offensive threat his team had, and is a forgotten great one that will hopefully find his way into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Think you know? Drop your guesses in the comments below. As always, if you like the content here on the Halls of History, be sure to click subscribe and hit that notification button to always know what is next. Don't forget you can catch up at any time right here with previous episodes on the Halls of History.